From the shadows of forgotten time, a story re-emerges, fierce, poetic, and unforgettable. You're listening to Echoes of Stories, where literature breathes anew. Tonight, we continue the saga of Edmond Dantès, the man who became legend, the Count of Monte Cristo. Crafted by Alexandre Dumas in 1844, this tale of revenge and redemption has never lost its fire. Drawn from Project Gutenberg's public domain archives, this is the story in its purest form. Prepare yourself. This is The Count of Monte Cristo, Episode 13. The next morning, Albert's very first words to Franz were a request that he accompany him on a visit to the Count. Albert had already expressed his gratitude the night before, but the young man felt that no amount of thanks could be enough for what had been done for him. Franz, meanwhile, felt a strange mix of fascination and unease toward the Count. He did not want to leave his friend alone with someone who carried such an unusual power over people. For that reason, he agreed at once and followed Albert to the Count's residence. After a short wait, the Count joined them in the salon. Albert repeated his gratitude with deep sincerity, believing that he owed the Count not only his freedom, but even his life. The Count dismissed the act as something minor. He reminded Albert that the only real benefit was the money saved from what would have been the ransom, and he claimed there was no real debt between them. What had impressed the Count most, however, was Albert's calmness. He admired the way the young man had accepted his fate without fear and had shown remarkable composure in the face of danger. Albert explained that he had not been particularly brave. He had simply chosen to face events as they came, showing the bandits that the French could remain cheerful even when death was near. He then turned the conversation to his sense of obligation. He wished to know how he, his family, or his connections might serve the Count in return. His father, the Count de Morcerf, though of Spanish descent, held great influence both in France and Spain. Albert was eager to place that influence at the Count's disposal. The Count accepted this offer with sincerity, explaining that it was exactly what he had expected. In fact, he revealed that he had already intended to ask Albert for a favor. To the surprise of both young men, the Count confessed that he had never been to Paris. At his age, such a fact seemed almost impossible, yet it was true. He admitted that he had long wished to visit, but had lacked the proper acquaintances to introduce him into Parisian society. Without such connections, he had abandoned the idea altogether. Albert insisted that someone of the Count's stature would hardly need an introduction, but the Count disagreed. He explained that his wealth alone was not enough to enter the fashionable world. While he could have joined financial dealings with men like Aguado or Rothschild, he had no interest in stock speculation. Instead, he wanted a genuine entrance into Parisian life, and Albert's offer now gave him the opportunity he had been waiting for. With a peculiar smile, the Count asked whether Albert would take responsibility for opening the doors of Parisian society to him. Albert readily agreed, even adding that a letter from his father had arrived that very morning, calling him back to Paris. The reason was a marriage arrangement with a family of high social standing. He joked that by the time Franz returned to Paris, he might already be settled into the life of a respectable family man. The Count, satisfied with the assurance, stated that the matter was decided. He explained that he had long planned such a visit and had only been waiting for the right opportunity to make it a reality. Franz quickly realized that the Count's plans were the same ones hinted at earlier in the Grotto of Monte Cristo. While the Count spoke, Franz studied his expression, hoping to uncover some clue to his true intentions. Yet the man's face revealed nothing. A faint, unreadable smile, almost like that of a sphinx, concealed his thoughts completely. Albert, on the other hand, felt great excitement. The idea of guiding such a remarkable figure as the Count through Paris seemed to him an honor. He asked if the plan was genuine or merely one of those fanciful dreams that so often vanish at the first difficulty. The Count assured him that he spoke with absolute seriousness. Both personal inclination and pressing necessity compelled him to visit Paris. Albert explained that he would travel there himself within 2 or 3 weeks. The Count, however, decided on a longer delay, promising to arrive in 3 months. They agreed to fix the date precisely. To show his exactness, the Count noted the calendar in his watch. It was February 21st, 10:30 in the morning. He asked Albert to expect him at his home in Paris on May 21st, at the same hour. Albert gladly agreed, promising to have breakfast waiting. The Count then asked for his address, and Albert replied that he lived at number 27, Rue du Helder, in a separate pavilion of his father's house. The Count carefully wrote this down in his notebook and assured Albert that he would keep the appointment with greater accuracy than even a clock could show. Albert then wondered if they would meet again before his own departure. The Count explained that he had to leave for Naples and would not return until after Albert was gone. Franz also revealed that he too would depart, though not for France. He planned to stay in Italy for several more years, continuing his travels. The Count then offered both young men his good wishes for safe and pleasant journeys. When Franz shook hands with him, he felt a cold, almost lifeless touch that sent a shiver through his body. After leaving, Albert reminded Franz of the exact terms of the promise. The Count had pledged on his honor to be at number 27, Rue du Helder, on May 21st at 10:30 in the morning. Franz confirmed what he had heard, but remained uneasy. Once back in their own rooms, Albert noticed his friend's troubled expression. Franz admitted that the thought of this appointment filled him with many fears. He found the Count to be a most unusual man, one who gave him a sense of unease that he could not shake. Albert tried to dismiss these concerns, laughing at the idea of such worry. He pointed out that the Count had shown nothing but courtesy, while Franz seemed distant toward him. Franz finally confessed that he had indeed met the Count before. This revelation astonished Albert, who pressed for details. Franz hesitated, but made Albert promise on his honor never to repeat what he was about to hear. Only then did he begin to share his secret. Franz recounted to his friend the full story of his journey to the island of Monte Cristo. He described discovering a group of smugglers there, along with 2 Corsican bandits in their company. What struck him most, however, was the extraordinary hospitality he received from a mysterious Count. The magnificence of the grotto, arranged like something out of the tales of the 1001 Nights, left a lasting impression. He described every detail: the luxurious supper, the strange effects of the hashish, the lifelike statues, and the vivid dream that followed. Yet when he awoke, there was no trace of any of it. The only sign that it had not been pure imagination was a small yacht on the horizon, sailing swiftly toward Porto Vecchio. Franz also shared the incident at the Colosseum, where he had secretly overheard a conversation between the Count and the bandit chief, Vampa. During that exchange, the Count promised to secure the release of a captured outlaw named Peppino, a promise he later kept with exact faithfulness. Finally, Franz told of the previous night's adventure. He explained the difficult position he found himself in when he lacked several hundred piastres to complete a payment. He then described how he had turned to the Count for help and how that request led to a surprisingly picturesque and satisfying resolution. Albert listened intently to every word. In response, Albert offered his own interpretation. To him, nothing Franz had described seemed extraordinary. The Count, he argued, was simply a wealthy traveler who enjoyed the freedom of owning his own yacht, just as many English gentlemen did. By purchasing the island of Monte Cristo, he had secured for himself a base of operations during his journeys, while protecting his investment from outside interference. Albert pointed out that men often took the names of estates they did not own. At least the Count had the honesty of actually possessing his island. Albert also dismissed Franz's concerns about the Corsican bandits. He reminded him that such men were often fugitives driven from their homes, rather than common thieves, and that their company carried no dishonor. Franz, however, could not ignore that Vampa and his followers were dangerous criminals, and he questioned how the Count could command such influence over them. Albert brushed this aside as well. To him, the answer mattered less than the benefit. That influence had saved not only his freedom, but also a large sum of money. Franz then raised a deeper question, the mystery of the Count's origin. He wondered about the man's country, language, fortune, and the unknown events of his past that seemed to have darkened his outlook on life. Albert reminded him that when Franz had sought the Count's aid, the man had not demanded to know anything about Albert's identity or background. Instead, he had acted at once, with no hesitation, to secure his release from Vampa. For that reason, Albert considered it only fair to grant the Count's single request, an introduction into Parisian society. To do otherwise, he believed, would be both ungrateful and absurd. This time, it had to be admitted that, unlike most of their discussions, the stronger reasoning rested with Albert. Franz, unable to counter those points, accepted his friend's decision, though he continued to feel that the Count of Monte Cristo remained an extraordinary figure. Albert believed the Count to be a man devoted to philanthropy. In his view, the purpose of the Count's stay in Paris was connected to the Monthyon Prize, an honor granted to the individual judged to have most advanced the cause of virtue and humanity. Albert felt prepared to support such a claim, both with his influence and his vote. With that matter settled in his own mind, he turned his attention away from the Count, preferring instead to focus on lighter plans. Franz agreed without protest, and the young men turned their thoughts toward the simple pleasures of their day. They would enjoy their midday meal together, and afterward visit St. Peter's once more before parting. The following afternoon, at 5:30, the two companions went their separate ways. Albert de Morcerf prepared to return to Paris, while Franz d'Épinay set off for Venice, where he intended to spend a fortnight. Yet before leaving, Albert made sure to confirm the arrangement with the Count of Monte Cristo. Concerned that their guests might overlook the appointment, he left a note with a hotel waiter. On the card, placed beneath his own name, Viscount Albert de Morcerf, he carefully wrote the address and time. 27, Rue du Helder, on the 21st of May, at 10:30 in the morning. In the house on Rue du Helder, where Albert had invited the Count of Monte Cristo, everything was carefully arranged on the morning of May 21st to honor the occasion. Albert de Morcerf lived in a small pavilion placed at the corner of a large courtyard, facing another building where the servants stayed. 2 windows looked toward the street, 3 opened into the courtyard, and 2 more faced the garden at the back. Between the garden and the courtyard stood the grand residence of the Count and Countess of Morcerf, built in the heavy style of imperial architecture. The entire property was surrounded by a high wall, decorated at intervals with vases of flowers, and broken in the center by a gilded iron gate wide enough for carriages. A smaller door near the concierge's lodge allowed both masters and servants to come and go on foot. It was easy to see that Albert's mother had chosen this place with care. She wished to stay close to her son, but also understood that a young man of his age needed freedom. Signs of Albert's indulgent lifestyle were everywhere. He was the only son, enjoying a careless and luxurious life, almost like living inside a gilded cage. From the windows facing the street, he could watch everything that happened outside. Young men often need to see the movement of the world, even if that view is only a busy street. If something demanded closer attention, Albert had access to a small hidden gate. This entrance appeared untouched and covered in dust, yet its hinges and locks were polished and ready for use. It was invisible to the concierge and operated like the magical door in the Arabian Nights, swinging open at the right word or a gentle knock from favored visitors. Beyond the gate stretched a long corridor that served as an antechamber. On the right side stood Albert's breakfast room overlooking the courtyard, and on the left a salon that opened into the garden. Both rooms were partly concealed by shrubs and climbing plants, shielding them from curious eyes. The upper floor held 3 rooms, a salon, a boudoir, and a bedroom, while the ground-level salon was arranged as an Algerian-style smoking room. The boudoir upstairs connected to the bedroom through a hidden doorway by the stairs. Every detail suggested careful thought and privacy. Above this level was a large atelier, expanded by removing partitions, a chaotic place where Albert's shifting passions filled the space. There lay musical instruments from past enthusiasms, easels and paints from his attempts at art, and weapons from his training in boxing, fencing, and single stick. Here he practiced with Grizier, Cooks, and Charles Labouture. Cabinets held Chinese porcelain, Japanese vases, faiences, and platters. Heavy old armchairs stood around, some likely taken from royal residences. Draped over them were rich Persian fabrics and Indian silks, their bright colors glowing in the dim light. At the center stood a rosewood baby grand piano by Roller and Blanchett, bearing the weight of compositions by Beethoven, Weber, Mozart, and others. On the walls and ceiling hung swords, armor, exotic weapons, dried plants, minerals, and stuffed birds with open beaks and spread wings. This was Albert's favored retreat. Yet on the morning of his appointment, Albert settled in the smaller salon below. On a table before him lay a display of tobaccos from all parts of the world: Petersburg to Sinai, Maryland to Puerto Rico, Latakia and beyond. The leaves filled Dutch earthen pots, while fragrant wooden boxes held cigars of every type. Nearby stood a cabinet with German pipes, chabuks with amber tips, and narghiles with long tubes. Albert himself had arranged this elegant disorder, knowing that after coffee, guests would admire such things while smoke curled upward in shifting shapes. At 9:45, his valet Germain entered. Germain, together with a young English groom named John, made up Albert's small household, though a hotel cook was always available, and sometimes the Count's chasseur helped on special occasions. Germain carried papers in one hand and letters in the other. Albert flipped through them carelessly, but kept 2 delicate notes sealed in scented envelopes, which he read with attention. One had arrived by post, while the other had been delivered by Madame Danglars' footman. Albert prepared responses, arranging for his presence at the opera, later supper with Rosa, and gifts of wine and oysters to be sent. He then confirmed that breakfast would be served at 10:30, the very time he had promised the Count of Monte Cristo. After giving instructions for one of his mother's liqueur cases to be brought and a message delivered that he would visit her around 3 o'clock, Albert reclined on the divan. He tore open several newspapers, scanned the theater listings, frowned at the lack of a ballet, and searched in vain for an advertisement of a new tooth powder. At last he tossed the papers aside in frustration, muttering to himself that they seemed more foolish with every passing day. A carriage soon stopped in front of the house, and the servant announced the arrival of Lucien Debray. He was a tall young man with light hair, sharp gray eyes, and thin lips pressed tightly together. His appearance was polished and formal. He wore a blue coat with finely carved gold buttons, a white neckcloth, and carried a tortoise-shell monocle on a silken thread, which he fixed in place with the muscles of his face. He entered the room with a half-official air, offering no smile or greeting. Albert was surprised by his punctuality. He had expected Lucien to be the last to arrive, yet here he was before the appointed time. Lucien reassured him that nothing serious had happened with the government, though he admitted that their ministry always seemed unstable. In his view, instead of collapsing, it might simply become immovable, especially now that political matters in Spain promised to strengthen their position. Albert recalled the situation with Don Carlos, and Lucien explained that instead of being driven out, the royal pretender would be settled across the French border of Bourges. News of this move had spread quickly, so much so that Danglars had already turned it into financial gain on the stock market. Albert noticed the blue ribbon pinned to Lucien's coat and remarked on his new honor. Lucien downplayed the recognition, saying it was merely the order of Charles III, and that it added nothing more than a decorative finish to his attire. Still, Albert pressed him, pointing out that such an honor must have pleased him. Lucien admitted little, but the early hour of his visit betrayed his restlessness. He explained that he had spent the entire night writing official dispatches, and after failing to rest, he went for a ride at the Bois de Boulogne. Boredom and hunger struck him at once, and he remembered Albert's breakfast invitation. He had come hoping to be both fed and entertained. Albert welcomed him and rang for refreshments. He offered sherry, biscuits, and cigars, which he proudly described as rare contraband. Lucien laughed at the suggestion of asking the government to provide such luxuries, pointing out that if they ever did, they would be dreadful in quality. He lit a cigar and commented on Albert's fortune in having nothing to do, while his own life was consumed by political work. Albert responded with irony, reminding Lucien that his duties involved power, influence, and privileges that many would envy. Lucien only sighed and admitted that he still longed for diversion. Albert promised to amuse him by introducing someone new. Lucien asked whether this new acquaintance was a man or a woman. Albert replied that it was a man, one unlike anyone Lucien had met before, perhaps from the farthest reaches of the world. Lucien joked about hoping the guest was not bringing breakfast, and Albert assured him that the meal was being prepared in his father's kitchen. They continued speaking lightly of food and politics. Lucien confessed a hunger, admitting that he had dined the night before with Villefort, where the fare had been poor. Albert teased him about the fine dinners given by ministers, and Lucien retorted that such occasions were more obligations than pleasures. They shared more sherry while speaking of Spain, Don Carlos, and the future of politics. Their talk ended with Lucien remarking that Albert seemed intent on feeding him with smoke alone. At that moment, Albert heard Beecham arrive in the next room. The servant soon announced him. Albert greeted the young journalist warmly, introducing him to Lucien, who in turn acknowledged Beauchamp's presence with good humor. They exchanged brief remarks about Lucien's new honor and joked about the state of politics and the newspapers. Beecham said he must leave soon for the chamber, reminding Albert that his own life was far from idle. Albert assured him that breakfast would begin as soon as the two remaining guests arrived. Albert welcomed him and rang for refreshments. He offered sherry, biscuits, and cigars, which he proudly described as rare contraband. Lucien laughed at the suggestion of asking the government to provide such luxuries, pointing out that if they ever did, they would be dreadful in quality. He lit a cigar and commented on Albert's fortune in having nothing to do, while his own life was consumed by political work. Albert responded with irony, reminding Lucien that his duties involved power, influence, and privileges that many would envy. Lucien only sighed and admitted that he still longed for diversion. Albert promised to amuse him by introducing someone new. Lucien asked whether this new acquaintance was a man or a woman. Albert replied that it was a man, one unlike anyone Lucien had met before, perhaps from the farthest reaches of the world. Lucien joked about hoping the guest was not bringing breakfast, and Albert assured him that the meal was being prepared in his father's kitchen. They continued speaking lightly of food and politics. Lucien confessed a hunger, admitting that he had dined the night before with Villefort, where the fare had been poor. Albert teased him about the fine dinners given by ministers, and Lucien retorted that such occasions were more obligations than pleasures. They shared more sherry while speaking of Spain, Don Carlos, and the future of politics. Their talk ended with Lucien remarking that Albert seemed intent on feeding him with smoke alone. At that moment, Albert heard Beecham arrive in the next room. The servant soon announced him. Albert greeted the young journalist warmly, introducing him to Lucien, who in turn acknowledged Beauchamp's presence with good humor. They exchanged brief remarks about Lucien's new honor and joked about the state of politics and the newspapers. Beauchamp said he must leave soon for the chamber, reminding Albert that his own life was far from idle. Albert assured him that breakfast would begin as soon as the two remaining guests arrived. Beauchamp asked Albert what sort of guests he expected at breakfast. Albert replied that a gentleman and a diplomatist were due. Beauchamp laughed, saying that such men would make them wait hours, and he threatened to return only in time for dessert. Albert insisted they would eat by 11 at the latest, and urged him to follow Debray's example with sherry and biscuits. Beauchamp agreed, needing some distraction, though he admitted that gloomy thoughts weighed on him. He explained that Danglars would be speaking that morning at the Chamber of Deputies, and later he would have to endure another performance at Madame Danglars' house. He cursed the burdens of constitutional government, complaining that the choice they were given was poor indeed. Debray defended Danglars, reminding Beauchamp that Danglars supported the opposition. Beauchamp found that even worse, since it forced him to listen to speeches he did not respect. Albert teased him, saying his ill humor revealed that Spain's political affairs must be settled, leaving Beauchamp with no cause for outrage. Albert also reminded him of the gossip linking his own name with Eugenie Danglars, suggesting he could hardly insult a man who might one day give his daughter with 2 million francs. Beauchamp dismissed the idea, convinced that such a marriage would never happen. In his view, the Count of Morcerf was far too aristocratic to consent to what he called a misalliance, no matter the fortune attached. Albert countered that 2 million francs was no small sum, but Beauchamp replied with sarcasm, comparing it to the budget of a boulevard theater or a local railway line. Debray encouraged Albert to marry anyway, insisting that wealth could balance any loss of prestige. Albert seemed half convinced, though Beauchamp laughed at Debray's paradoxes. Their exchange was interrupted by the arrival of Château and Maximilien Morel. Château entered with elegance, greeting Albert warmly and introducing Maximilien Morel as both his friend and his savior. He stepped aside so Albert could meet the young officer, a man of dignified bearing with a broad forehead, sharp eyes, and a dark mustache. His uniform blended French and Oriental styles, and the cross of the Legion of Honor gleamed on his chest. Albert received him with genuine courtesy, pleased at the introduction. Château insisted that Albert should recognize Morel as his hero. Albert, curious, asked what had happened. Morel modestly downplayed the matter, but Château insisted that Morel had saved his life. Beauchamp wanted to hear the details, though Debray, still impatient for food, begged that the story be kept short. Albert held them back, reminding the group that another guest was expected. He hinted at a mysterious man who had carried out a mission on his behalf with such success that Albert would have granted him the highest honors had he been king. While they waited, Debray pressed Château to explain what had happened in Africa. Château admitted that his journey to Africa was more for adventure than duty. He recalled his dislike of duels after an affair where he had been forced to wound a close friend, Franz d'Épinay. Seeking new excitement, he had traveled to Oran and then to Constantine, arriving just as the siege was being lifted. He joined a retreat and endured hardship for 2 days, surviving the rain and cold. But on the third morning, his horse collapsed and died, unable to withstand the freezing temperatures that were so different from its Arabian climate. Debray joked that Châteaurenaud's ordeal explained why he wanted an English horse, believing it would endure the cold better. Châteaurenaud corrected him, saying he had vowed never to return to Africa. Beauchamp pressed him further, asking if he had been so frightened. Châteaurenaud admitted he had, and with good reason. After his horse died, he had been retreating on foot when 6 Arabs rode up to kill him. He managed to shoot 4, but was left defenseless against the last 2. One seized him by the hair, the other raised a yataghan. He had already felt the blade against his neck when Morel charged in, shot one attacker, and split the skull of the other with a saber. Chance, Château declared, had chosen him as the man to be saved that day. He vowed that, if ever rich, he would commission a statue of Chance. Morel, smiling, added that the day had been September 5th, the anniversary of his father's miraculous survival. Each year, he tried to mark it with some worthy action. Château interrupted, insisting he had been the one selected that time. He went on, explaining that Morel not only saved him from death, but also from cold and hunger. Unlike Saint Martin, Morel gave him not half a cloak but the whole. Later, they even shared Morel's horse for food, each cutting and eating a slice to stay alive. Château laughed at the sacrifice and asked Debray if he would ever do the same for a stranger. Debray answered that he might for a friend, though not for anyone else. Morel responded calmly that he had already guessed they would become friends, and that, regardless of the act itself, he owed some offering that day to fate. Château hinted that Morel's family history contained a story worth telling, but said that tale was for another time. For now, he suggested they should focus on breakfast rather than memories. Albert noted it was to be served at 10:30. Debray checked his watch, demanding exactness. Albert asked for 5 minutes grace, since he still expected another guest. This one, Albert explained, had also been a rescuer, his own. Their breakfast, he declared, would bring together two benefactors of humanity. Beecham teased that only one Monthyon prize existed for virtue, and that it was often awarded to someone undeserving. Debray asked where this mysterious guest was coming from. Albert admitted he did not know. When he extended the invitation 3 months earlier, the man had been in Rome. Since then, he might have traveled anywhere. Debray doubted his punctuality, but Albert insisted he was capable of anything. With a few minutes left, Albert promised to tell them more about this guest. Beecham asked if the account contained material for an article. Albert assured him it did. He explained that during the last carnival in Rome, he had been abducted by bandits. Debray scoffed that bandits no longer existed. Albert contradicted him, saying they did, and they were terrifying enough to haunt him. Debray joked that Albert was merely stalling because his oysters had not arrived from Ostend or Marennes, and that he was replacing the meal with a story. Albert, however, insisted it was all true. He had been seized and carried to a dark and fearful place, the catacombs of Saint Sebastian. Château recalled how narrowly he had escaped catching a fever in that same place. Morcerf went further, explaining that he had actually fallen ill. He described how he had been told he was a prisoner until he could pay 4,000 Roman crowns, about 24,000 francs. Unfortunately, he had only 1,500. With no money and no credit left, he wrote to Franz, declaring that if the money did not arrive by 6 o'clock, he would surely be dead by 10 minutes past. The bandit chief, Luigi Vampa, would have kept his word without hesitation. Château noted that Franz had indeed brought the money, as a man with such a name could easily obtain it. But Morcerf clarified that Franz had not come alone. He had been accompanied by the guest he now intended to introduce. This man was not a giant warrior, nor armed in any way. He carried not even a needle. Yet, by saying only 2 words to the chief, he secured Morcerf's freedom. The bandits even apologized for seizing him. Beecham and the others reacted with disbelief, calling the man a second Ariosto. But Morcerf simply revealed that his rescuer was known as the Count of Monte Cristo. The others doubted the title. Debray insisted no such count existed. Château, confident in his knowledge of European nobility, agreed. They speculated about the name, suggesting perhaps it came from the Holy Land. At this point, Maximilian Morel offered a clue. He explained that Monte Cristo was in fact a small island in the Mediterranean, often mentioned by sailors. Albert confirmed it, saying that this man had purchased the title of Count in Tuscany. He admitted the Count was wealthy, though his fortune was hidden in mysterious ways, like the treasures in the Arabian Nights. Albert continued, describing how the Count even called himself Sinbad the Sailor. He possessed a secret cave filled with gold. Franz, though blindfolded, had once entered it and had been served by silent attendants and women of extraordinary beauty. Yet, because of the effects of hashish, Franz was unsure whether they had truly been women or only statues. His listeners exchanged doubtful looks, uncertain whether Albert was serious or mocking them. Morel quietly supported him, recalling that an old sailor named Penelon had spoken of similar tales. Albert seized upon this as proof, insisting that his friends were now closer to believing. The others still found the story too extraordinary. Debray teased Albert, saying that ambassadors and consuls never reported such things because they were too busy with other duties. He joked about sending Albert himself as an ambassador to Constantinople, though Albert refused, saying he had no wish to be strangled for taking sides. Returning to the subject, Albert insisted the Count truly existed. He spoke of the man's retinue of black servants, his vast arsenal of weapons, horses worth 6,000 francs each, and even a Greek mistress. He had seen her with his own eyes at the theater, and once heard her sing while breakfasting with the Count. The group laughed, calling the man a vampire. Beecham compared the tale to the sea serpent reported in the newspapers. Debray gave a vivid description of the Count's striking appearance, his intense eyes, strong features, pale complexion, dark beard, sharp white teeth, and impeccable politeness. Albert agreed, saying that the Count's politeness was so cold and cutting it often made him shudder. Once, during an execution, he had nearly fainted at the calm tone with which the man described torture. His friends teased him further, imagining the Count as a blood drinker or a devil demanding souls. Morcerf, slightly offended, insisted that Parisians idling on boulevards were not of the same race as such a man. Château admitted the Count was impressive, though he questioned his connections with bandits. Debray denied both bandits and vampires, declaring there was no Count of Monte Cristo. Just then, the clock struck 10:30. Beecham suggested that Albert had only dreamed his tale and urged that they sit for breakfast. But before the clock's echo had faded, Germain entered to announce the arrival of the Count of Monte Cristo. Everyone started involuntarily, proof of how deeply Albert's story had unsettled them. Albert himself could not entirely hide his own sudden emotion. No carriage had been heard stopping outside, no footsteps in the antechamber. The door had opened without sound. The Count entered, dressed in the simplest fashion, yet with such refinement that even the most critical eye could find no fault. Each article, hat, coat, gloves, and boots, came from the finest makers. He appeared scarcely 35, and the most striking feature was how closely he resembled the portrait that Debray had described. Advancing with a calm smile, he approached Albert, who moved toward him with formality. Monte Cristo excused his slight delay, remarking that punctuality might be the politeness of kings, but was difficult for travelers covering 500 leagues, especially in France, where postilions could not be beaten. Albert introduced him to his friends. Château, descended from the 12 peers and the Knights of the Round Table. Lucien Debray, secretary to the Minister of the Interior. Beecham, an editor whose newspaper defied governments yet was banned in Italy. And Maximilian Morel, captain of spies. At Morel's name, the Count, who until then had greeted the others with cold courtesy, stepped forward. A faint flush colored his pale face. He praised the handsome uniform of France's new conquerors, his voice vibrating with an emotion no one could explain, and his usually clear eyes flashed with a sudden fire. Albert asked if he had seen the African campaigns. The Count replied that he had not. Albert spoke warmly of Morel's bravery and recounted a heroic act just performed, asking the Count's permission to call him his friend. At those words, Monte Cristo's gaze grew concentrated, His complexion shifted, and a slight tremor touched his eyelid, all betraying inner feeling. He exclaimed that Morel had a noble heart, speaking more to his own thought than to Albert's remark. The gentle intonation, however strange, prevented offense. Beauchamp whispered to Château, who answered that Albert had not deceived them. The Count was indeed a singular being. Morel, though puzzled, admitted that Monte Cristo's open manner pleased him despite the odd comment. Albert announced that breakfast was ready, and the group passed silently into the dining room. Monte Cristo began by confessing his ignorance of Parisian ways. He explained that this was his first visit to the city and that he still followed Eastern customs, so different from those of France. He asked pardon for any improprieties and invited them to begin. Beauchamp, observing the air with which he spoke, muttered that the man was certainly great. Debray answered that he might be great in his own land. Château corrected him, insisting he was great in every country. During the meal, Albert noted how little the Count ate, expressing concern that Parisian fare might displease him after the delights of Rome. Monte Cristo smiled, saying that Albert did not know him well enough. He explained that he could live on the simplest food anywhere: macaroni in Naples, polenta in Milan, olla podrida in Valencia, polo in Constantinople, curry in India, or swallow's nest in China. He ate everything, though always sparingly. That very day was an exception, for he had not eaten since the previous morning. His guests were astonished. He explained that, delayed by business near Nîmes, he had chosen neither to stop nor to eat. Instead, he had slept in his carriage. Morel inquired if he could sleep at will. The Count answered that he could, thanks to an infallible recipe. Such a skill, Morel observed, would be invaluable in Africa. Monte Cristo replied that what suited one man might endanger an entire army. Asked to reveal his method, he explained it openly. Pure opium from Canton mixed in equal measure with the finest hashish from the East, formed into small pills. The effect came within 10 minutes. Albert confirmed that Franz d'Épinay had once spoken of them. Beauchamp, skeptical, asked if he always carried them. The Count said that he did. At Beauchamp's request to see them, he produced a remarkable casket made of a single emerald, closed with a golden lid. From it he removed a greenish pellet the size of a pea, pungent in odor. 4 or 5 more rested inside, the box capable of holding a dozen. The casket was passed around the table, admired more for its gem-like beauty than for the curious pills it contained. Beauchamp asked if it was Monte Cristo's cook who prepared the mysterious pills. The Count replied that he entrusted such pleasures to no one. He was a tolerable chemist and made them himself. Château, turning the emerald casket in his hand, admired it as the largest stone he had ever seen, though his mother possessed remarkable jewels. Monte Cristo explained that he had once owned 3 similar stones. One he gave to the Sultan, who mounted it in his saber, another to the Pope, who set it in his tiara opposite a nearly equal gem gifted by Napoleon to Pius VII. The third he kept for himself, hollowed out for convenience, reducing its value but increasing its usefulness. The simplicity with which he spoke, together with the evidence of the jewel itself, left his listeners uncertain whether he spoke truth or madness. Debray asked what such sovereigns had given him in return. The Count answered with composure. The Sultan had granted the liberty of a woman, and the Pope the life of a man. For once in his life, he had been as powerful as though born upon the steps of a throne. Morcerf, recalling the event, cried that it was Peppino whose pardon he had obtained. Monte Cristo smiled and replied only, "Perhaps." Morcerf expressed his delight in hearing such confessions. He told his friends that he had presented the Count to them as an enchanter of the Arabian Nights, a wizard from the Middle Ages. Parisians, however, were so skeptical that they mistook genuine marvels for fancies when those marvels lay outside daily experience. Every day Debray read, and Beauchamp printed, reports of robberies, assassinations, and mass arrests in Paris. Yet they denied the existence of brigands in the Roman countryside. Morcerf insisted that they believe him when he said that he himself had been captured by such bandits, and that without Monte Cristo's intercession, he would have lain in the catacombs of Saint Sebastian instead of receiving them at breakfast in the Rue du Helder. The Count reminded him that he had promised never to mention the incident. Morcerf protested that he had made no such promise and urged him to speak openly. He offered to recount what he knew, provided Monte Cristo in turn supplied what he did not know. The Count agreed. Morcerf began with amusement, confessing that for 3 days he believed himself the object of attentions from a Roman noblewoman, while in truth he was pursued by a peasant girl, or, more accurately, by a boy disguised as one. Just as he prepared to kiss the youth, a pistol was thrust against his head. He was dragged to the catacombs of Saint Sebastian, where the bandit chief Luigi Vampa received him, laying aside Caesar's commentaries long enough to announce that unless 4,000 piastres were paid by dawn, his prisoner would die. Franz d'Épinay still kept the letter that bore Albert's signature and Vampa's postscript. Morcerf admitted he could not imagine how Monte Cristo commanded such respect for men who usually showed none. Monte Cristo answered that the explanation was simple. He had known Vampa since childhood, when the brigand had been a shepherd, guiding the Count through the hills. The boy had received a few gold coins, and in return had carved a poniard for him, still part of his collection. Years later, Vampa forgot the exchange and sought to capture him. Instead, the Count captured Vampa and a dozen of his men. He could have delivered them to swift Roman justice, but chose instead to release them. Beauchamp, laughing, suggested that he had released them on condition of sinning no more. Monte Cristo corrected him, saying the only condition was that they respect him and his friends. He admitted that his view might seem strange to men who prided themselves on humanitarian ideals, but he did not attempt to defend a society that neither protected him nor spared him harm. By placing it low in his esteem, he felt that society owed him more than he owed it. Château applauded him for the courage of openly preaching egotism, while Morel observed that surely he must have once departed from such principles without regret. Monte Cristo asked how he had ever deviated, fixing upon Morel a gaze so penetrating that the young officer more than once found it difficult to endure. Morel objected gently to the Count's claim of pure egotism. By rescuing Albert de Morcerf, whom he scarcely knew, Monte Cristo had surely done good to both neighbor and society. Beauchamp, raising his glass, added playfully that Albert was the brightest ornament of that society. Albert himself insisted that the Count's logic betrayed him. Far from an egotist, he was a philanthropist. Parisian eccentricity, he said, consisted precisely in concealing one's virtues and parading borrowed vices, and Monte Cristo, despite styling himself an Oriental and a wanderer, had instinctively fallen into that habit. The Count replied with calm modesty. He did not see in his actions anything deserving such praise. Albert had not been a stranger. He had shared his Roman rooms with him, invited him to breakfast, lent him a carriage, and accompanied him to Carnival, and even to the dreadful execution in the Piazza del Popolo. Could he, then, abandon such a companion to a brigand's mercy? Besides, he had hoped Albert might one day introduce him into Parisian salons, and what had once seemed a vague project was now reality. Albert must keep his word. Albert accepted the charge with good humor, though he warned that the Count might find Parisian life disappointingly tame compared with his adventures. The great mountains of France were hills, its deserts no more than plains now pierced by artesian wells, and every grotto lit by police lamps. Still, he pledged himself to introduce the Count everywhere and to assist in securing him a suitable dwelling. He could not offer to share his own rooms, he added with a laugh, for they were too small to contain another presence, unless, perhaps, that presents were feminine. Monte Cristo remembered that Albert had spoken in Rome of marriage and offered congratulations. Albert replied the affair was still unsettled, though his father pressed it forward. Debray suggested that projected meant already arranged. Albert admitted that he hoped soon to present the Count to his betrothed, Mademoiselle Eugénie Danglars. At the mention of her name, Monte Cristo inquired after her father. Albert confirmed he was Baron Danglars, newly created. The Count remarked that such honors mattered little if the man had rendered service to the state. Beauchamp, with satirical humor, recounted the Baron's role in negotiating a vast loan for Charles X, which had earned him both title and ribbon. Albert rebuked Beauchamp for mocking his future father-in-law, then turned to the Count, asking if he knew Danglars. Monte Cristo said he did not, though soon he must, as he had opened credit with Danglars Bank by way of powerful firms in London, Vienna, and Rome. At the sound of Thompson in French, Maximilien Morel started visibly. The Count, noticing, asked if he knew the house. Maximilien explained that they had once rendered his family a service, though they denied it now. The Count assured him of his influence and offered his assistance, to which Maximilien bowed gratefully. Albert then returned the talk to its original thread, urging his friends to propose suitable lodgings for their exotic guest. Château suggested a grand house in the Faubourg Saint-Germain. Debray countered with the Chaussée d'Antin, the true heart of Paris. Beauchamp pictured a balcony on the Boulevard de l'Opéra, from which Monte Cristo could smoke his chibouque while watching all of Paris flow beneath. Finally, Maximilien Morel offered a more intimate arrangement, a suite in his sister's Pompadour-style hotel in the Rue Meslay. She was happily married to Emmanuel Herbaut, who had stood by their family in misfortune, and both would be at the Count's disposal. Monte Cristo listened with quiet attention, but Albert interjected hastily, warning his friends not to immure so adventurous a traveler in too domestic a retreat. Morel reassured his friends that his sister's household would not confine Monte Cristo. His sister and brother-in-law were young, lively, and welcoming, and the Count would have his independence, seeing them only when he wished. The Count, however, declined politely. He would be glad to meet them through Morel's introduction, yet he could not accept anyone's offer of lodging. His own residence was already arranged. This startled Albert, who supposed the Count had resigned himself to a dull hotel. Monte Cristo answered with a smile, reminding them how well he had been lodged in Rome. There, it was true, he had spent a fortune furnishing his apartments, but he explained that this was not his intention in Paris. Instead, he had dispatched his valet a week earlier to purchase and furnish a house. This admission surprised everyone, for the valet in question was none other than Ali, the Nubian mute they remembered from Rome. Albert wondered aloud how a mute could possibly be entrusted with such a responsibility. Monte Cristo corrected the notion. Ali knew his master's tastes instinctively and could be trusted to act with precision. Indeed, Ali had met him at the city gates that very morning with a note containing the address of the new house. The Count handed the slip to Albert as proof, and the company marveled at both the originality and the princely scale of such arrangements. Still unconvinced, Debray pressed further. Did the Count even know the house chosen for him? Monte Cristo replied calmly that he did not. He had been too punctual in his arrival to examine it, and had gone straight to Albert's door. His words carried such natural simplicity that none could suspect them of falsehood. Accepting this eccentricity, Beauchamp offered his own services as a journalist, opening the theaters to the newcomer. Monte Cristo replied with quiet amusement that his steward already held boxes at each theater. This steward, as Debray inquired, was not another Nubian, but a Corsican named Bertuccio. At the mention of Bertuccio, Albert recalled the capable man who had once found them a vantage point in Rome. Monte Cristo described him frankly, once a soldier, later a smuggler, perhaps even entangled with the police in some violent affair. Yet for all that, he served the Count faithfully, knowing no impossibility, and thus was retained. Château observed that with a house, a steward, and such resources, the only thing lacking was a mistress. Albert smiled to himself, recalling the beautiful Greek woman he had glimpsed in the Count's theater box. Monte Cristo replied with deliberate provocation that he had something better, a slave purchased in Constantinople, far dearer than an opera dancer, yet far more secure. Debray laughed that in France no slave could remain a slave, for the first person to see her would tell her she was free. Monte Cristo responded coolly. She spoke only Romaic, and in any case, all who lived with him were free to leave when they chose. For that reason, perhaps, none of them ever did. His tone was calm, but the underlying suggestion only deepened the air of mystery surrounding him. By this time, the table had passed to dessert and cigars. Debray rose, reminding Albert that duty called him back to the ministry. He promised to report the Count to his superiors, and perhaps Parisian police funds might succeed where rumor had failed, though Albert doubted it. One by one, the company rose: Beauchamp, Château, and finally Morel, who left his card and secured Monte Cristo's promise to visit his family home in the Rue Meslay. With farewells exchanged, the guests departed, leaving the enigmatic Count alone at last with Albert de Morcerf.